There is a town in Europe where you can stand in the Netherlands, take 3 steps forward, and be in Belgium, take 2 more steps and be back in the Netherlands again, all without leaving the same block of pavement. The international border does not run along one side of a river or down the middle of a road. It zigzags through living rooms, across restaurant dining tables, through the middle of shop floors, and in at least one case, directly through the front door of a private home. The town is called Baarle-Nassau on the Dutch side and Baarle-Hertog on the Belgian side, and it contains around 30 distinct international borders packed into an area that most people would consider a single, unremarkable village. To be clear about what that means, 30 separate lines where the sovereignty of one nation ends and the sovereignty of another begins, all coiled together inside one small settlement in the flat heathland of North Brabant, roughly 20 kilometers south of the Dutch city of Tilburg. Not 30 borders around the town's outer edge. 30 borders threading through the interior of it, through streets, through gardens, through walls. The kind of borders that, in most places, are dramatic physical things: walls, fences, checkpoint booths, rivers. Here, they are marked by nothing more than small metal studs pressed into the pavement and white crosses painted onto the asphalt, each one stamped with either AB for Belgium or NL for the Netherlands. Most people, if they heard that a town sat on the Belgian-Dutch border, would picture something simple: one country on the left side of the road, the other country on the right. Baarle is not that. Baarle-Nassau is a Dutch municipality that contains 22 enclaves of Belgian territory nested inside it. Those Belgian enclaves belong to a separate municipality called Baarle-Hertog. And then, inside the largest of those Belgian enclaves, there are 7 further enclaves of Dutch territory again, islands of the Netherlands inside islands of Belgium inside the Netherlands. The technical term for that third layer is a counter-enclave, and there are almost none anywhere else on Earth. A visiting geographer once described trying to map the place as an exercise in recursive geometry. He was not wrong. The question everyone asks, standing on one of those painted white crosses with 1 foot on each country, is, how did this happen? And the honest answer is that it happened slowly, accidentally, and because of a series of medieval land deals made by men who were thinking about farming, not about future international borders. The name Baarle appears in the historical record as far back as 992, though the dispute that created the modern situation began crystallizing in 1198. At that time, the land was under the control of a nobleman named Godfried van Schoten, the Lord of Breda. He was caught between 2 powerful neighbors, Count Hendrik I of Brabant, who controlled territory to the south, and Dirk VII, the Duke of Holland, who was pressing down from the north. To avoid being absorbed by Dirk, Godfried made a calculated move. He transferred his land to Count Hendrik of Brabant, who immediately handed it back to him as a formal loan, a feudal legal maneuver that gave Godfried protection while acknowledging Brabant's theoretical ownership. In exchange, Godfried received additional land as a reward. The result was that certain plots of land became Brabant property while others, tied to the House of Nassau which came to control Breda, remained under different governance. Over the following 2 centuries, the land changed hands repeatedly through marriages, inheritances, sales, and protection agreements. The crucial problem was not the transfers themselves but their shape. Rather than trading compact, contiguous blocks of territory, the feudal lords exchanged individual farm plots and scattered fields based on agricultural value and personal allegiance rather than any geographic logic. A valuable meadow here. A productive arable field there. A strip of common land somewhere else entirely. Each transaction made perfect economic sense in the 12th or 13th century, when the idea of a hard national border between 2 sovereign states was centuries away. Nobody designing these arrangements imagined they were drawing international boundaries. They were just settling debts, securing alliances, and managing agricultural assets. After the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the set of treaties that reshaped European sovereignty, the lands tied to Nassau became part of the northern Netherlands, while the lands tied to Turnhout, which had become part of the barony of Brabant, fell under the southern Netherlands. The 2 halves were different jurisdictions now, but they still shared a language, a culture, and a relatively fluid administrative relationship. Then, in 1830, Belgium declared independence from the Netherlands, and what had previously been a bureaucratic inconvenience became an urgent geopolitical problem. The 2 halves of Baarle were suddenly in 2 different sovereign countries. Border commissions were dispatched to establish a clear line. They encountered the full chaos of those centuries of fragmented land deals and quickly concluded that drawing a single clean boundary was simply impossible. Every time they tried to draw a line, it cut through a field that had been split between Nassau ownership and Brabant ownership since the 1200s. The solution they eventually reached, codified in the Treaty of Maastricht signed in August 1843, was remarkable for its pragmatism and its absolute refusal to simplify things. Rather than forcing a clean border, the treaty assigned the nationality of every single parcel of land individually, based on its documented historical ownership. 5,732 separate parcels. Each one examined, categorized, and assigned. The result between border markers 214 and 215 was not a line but a mosaic, a patchwork of interlocking Belgian and Dutch territory that followed ancient property boundaries with total indifference to modern notions of where a country should begin and end. Even after that, the process was not finished. The agreement clarified the nationality of those thousands of parcels but did not immediately produce the physical border lines painted on pavements that exist today. That groundwork took further decades of incremental surveying and local negotiations. The actual lines you can follow on foot through the town today were not formally finalized and made fully official until 1995, when a previously disputed grassland was finally assigned and the last loose end was closed. For most of the 20th century, Baarle existed in a state of officially documented but not yet fully demarcated complexity. It is a remarkable thing to consider, a border that took more than 150 years to finish drawing. So what does that look like on the ground, when you are actually walking through it? The metal studs and painted crosses are the first thing you notice. They run in straight lines and angled jogs across the pavement, then disappear into the walls of buildings, then re-emerge on the other side and continue down the street. You can follow a single border line from the footpath, through the doorway of a shop, across the shop floor, through the back wall, and into someone's garden. Inside a cafe, the line runs across the dining room floor, meaning that certain tables are legally in Belgium and certain other tables are in the Netherlands and the two sets of diners are eating under different legal codes simultaneously. The front door rule, known locally as the voordeurregel, was developed to manage the most direct practical problem. When a building sits on the border, which country does it belong to? The answer that Belgian and Dutch authorities settled on is that the building belongs to the country in which its front door sits. This single rule resolved an enormous amount of administrative confusion but also produced some extraordinary consequences. There are buildings in Baarle that have two front doors, one Belgian, one Dutch, so that the owners can choose their jurisdiction. There is a house on Louvren Street that has both a Belgian house number and a Dutch house number because its front door sits exactly on the border line itself, making even the front door rule ambiguous. And there is a documented case of a Belgian resident who physically relocated her front door to avoid being assigned Dutch nationality, repositioning the door so that it sat on the Belgian side of the boundary. Moving your front door to change your country of citizenship is not something most legal systems have had to account for. In Baarle, it happened. The practical daily consequences multiply when you begin to think them through. 2 town halls. 2 mayors. 2 police forces, which by necessity share a single building and coordinate closely on cross-border incidents. 2 fire stations operating under cost-sharing agreements so that whichever crew is nearest responds to an emergency regardless of which side of the border it falls on. 2 postal systems. 2 sets of tax rates. 2 planning permission processes for any renovation that crosses the line. 2 sets of building codes, which matters enormously in a town where one side of a house can legally be 1 story taller than the other side because the 2 countries have different height regulations. There is an apartment building in Baarle where this exact situation produced a structure with an extra door on the Belgian side, leading directly to a second floor that the Dutch half of the building is not officially permitted to have. For most of Baarle's modern history, this complexity was primarily a local curiosity, an administrative oddity that residents navigated with the casual expertise of people who have simply always lived that way. 2 world wars tested it in very different ways. During the First World War, Belgium was occupied by the German Imperial Army from August 1914. The Netherlands remained neutral. That combination produced a situation that was militarily extraordinary. The Belgian enclaves inside Baarle-Nassau were, in effect, free Belgian territory completely surrounded by the neutral Netherlands. German forces could not enter them without crossing Dutch soil, and crossing Dutch soil would have constituted a violation of Dutch neutrality, which Germany was at least formally trying to avoid. The resistance took full advantage of this. A clandestine Belgian military radio transmitter called Zenstation MN7 was smuggled into the enclave piece by piece, disguised as equipment for a refugee camp. Its central antenna mast rose 40 meters into the air. From the safety of Dutch-surrounded Belgian territory, the Belgian resistance used it to exchange coded messages and jam German communications. The Belgian postal service continued functioning through Baarle-Hertog's post office, with mail reaching Belgian soldiers at the Yser front in West Flanders by bypassing the entire German occupation. The Germans were furious and powerless at the same time. Eventually, they responded by constructing a section of the Dodendraad along the border, the Wire of Death, an electrified fence running along the Belgian-Dutch frontier, carrying 2,000 volts, built from the spring of 1915. Estimates of how many people died attempting to cross it range between 2,000 and 3,000 civilians. But inside the enclaves of Baarle, the resistance had already turned the geography into a weapon. The Second World War brought different complications. The German occupation attempted to impose unified Dutch customs and exchange laws across both sides of the town, an effort that failed in practice against a population expert in the art of jurisdictional navigation after centuries of living in two countries simultaneously. The most recent stress test came in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic forced Belgium and the Netherlands to impose entirely separate lockdown regimes. Belgium required masks in all public spaces. The Netherlands required them only on public transport. Belgian shops closed, Dutch shops across the same street stayed open. People living on some blocks were ordered to stay home while their immediate neighbors, separated from them by a few meters and a painted white cross, were free to go out. In a local art gallery that sits directly on the border, visitors entering from the Belgian side were legally required to wear masks. Once they walked a few feet across the interior border line onto the Dutch side, they were permitted to remove them. The town's thousands of physical markers, which for decades had seemed like quaint tourist attractions, suddenly became instruments of public health enforcement. Signs appeared in shop windows reading simply, "No mask required here." When you walk through Baarle today, the atmosphere is not tense. That is one of the most striking things about it. Both communities have had roughly 800 years to become accustomed to the situation, and the result is not conflict but a kind of practiced, matter-of-fact coexistence. The residents know which side of the line they are on. They know their house number carries a Belgian or Dutch flag next to it. They know which mayor represents them and which set of laws applies in their kitchen. The two communities share a single tourist office, which sits, of course, in the Dutch municipality but is jointly operated by both. The two police forces share a building. Emergency services respond across the border without hesitation. There is something in that ordinariness that is worth pausing on. Borders are usually treated as definitive, serious, permanent things. They determine where armies stop and where laws apply. They can reshape populations, trigger conflicts, strand families. But in Baarle, the border has been so relentlessly, absurdly present for so long that it has lost most of its capacity to divide. People eat dinner in two countries. They sleep with their head in Belgium and their feet in the Netherlands. They cross an international boundary by walking to the kitchen. The border is still real, the COVID pandemic demonstrated that clearly enough. But it is also, to the people who actually live with it, just another feature of where they happen to live. The white crosses in the pavement are as familiar to them as the curb stones. The flags on the house numbers are as unremarkable as the house numbers themselves. Baarle-Nassau, or Baarle-Hertog, or simply Baarle as its residents call it, is not unique because two countries failed to sort out their border properly. Plenty of borders in the world are poorly drawn or contested. Baarle is unique because the disorder is so complete, so thoroughly embedded in the physical fabric of the place, and so obviously unresolvable without demolishing the town and starting again, that everybody eventually just agreed to live inside the puzzle. There have been multiple opportunities over the past 2 centuries to negotiate a cleaner boundary, to swap territories, to straighten lines. The residents have declined every time. They chose the 30 borders over the one. That choice says something unusual about what a place can become when its strange circumstances are old enough and deep enough to be simply part of what it is. There are other towns in the world divided by borders. There is only one where the border divided itself 30 times over and the people on both sides decided they preferred it that way. The world is full of places that look unremarkable from the outside and turn out, when you look closely enough, to be unlike anything else on earth.